And joining us now for some further insight and breakdown into what's happening in Turkey right now is Sarabrynn Hudgins. She joins us from Washington, D.C., a Middle East analyst who's had some experience. You've been there, I understand. You've spent time in Turkey?
Yes, I have. I've lived in Ankara, Istanbul, and Izmir for work and study.
Working, and you've studied there. You've also worked with a defense contractor. We should state that early on. First of all, I understand you've been in contact with some people on the ground there in Turkey. Tell us just what the sense is there. People working in government, people have to be nervous for their jobs, their livelihoods. What's going on?
Yes, people are very nervous. There's a lot of tension, especially for people in Istanbul and Ankara, which, of course, were the two main cities where the coup attempt took place. Uh, Everyday people in Anatolia, their day-to-day lives have not been affected so much, but certainly people working in education, people working in the media, and people working for the government are all very conflicted right now. No one is quite sure how bad things are going to get. And for some people, losing their jobs would be the least of their worries. There are people being arrested, detained. It's getting pretty ugly.
And we're also seeing the Erdogan government push for a reinstatement of the death penalty. The European Union has said if you want to join us, you can't pick up the death penalty at any time soon. So there's this sort of clash of civilizations, or clash at least of policies, and whether or not Erdogan is pushing toward a one-party control here. This isn't the first time we've seen him have a crackdown on free speech, on free press, on expression, or on dissidents. He's done that for some time. They control social media there now, but obviously, there must have been some fear in the Erdogan camp that there was an uprising against him, and this is sort of his defense mechanism.
Absolutely. It's a direct response to the coup attempt. And of course, the idea of the civilian government reasserting control and tamping down a coup and preserving that democratic elected government is very appealing. But things have now gone drastically the other direction. And some of the arrests that were made, people are marveling that the list must have already been drawn up before the coup attempt happened, because it was several hours until there were thousands of police officers, thousands of soldiers in the Turkish armed forces arrested. So it's clear at this point that the response to the coup attempt is disproportionate, and it's all about Erdogan purging any opponents and critics from the judiciary to the police forces to education.
The State Department has already threatened NATO membership could be jeopardized here. Turkey could be flirting with disaster, withdrawing or isolating themselves from the NATO alliance, and that could topple a whole string of dominoes that we can't even speculate here today. But looking more domestically in Turkey, what's on the line for the political opponents? Turkey has traditionally been seen around the world as, yes, an Islamic majority nation, but a peaceful one at that, and one that has the secular rule. The military has been there, traditionally a close ally of Washington. What could we see in a very hostile region?
There was a long time, including through the early aughts, where Turkey was a very important Middle East ally, and it still is. It's a very important strategic partner, which is why this is so concerning for us here in the U.S. But as an ally, there was a point where Turkey was mediating between Syria and Israel, very active in the region, promoting peace with Iran and denuclearization there. So the concept of Turkey going from its previous policy of zero problems with neighbors to the last few years, things have devolved drastically. And certainly, we know it's very important that for the U.S. and our regional allies that the Turkey-Syria border be secure. That is where a lot of foreign fighters are transiting into Syria to join ISIS. So there are pre-existing issues that don't have necessarily to do with Turkish politics, but that will certainly be worsened by this domestic instability.
Now, we know that there's also the conflict of ISIS fighting just south of their borders. There's been those attacks. There's been several ISIS has claimed responsibility, rather, for several terrorist attacks north of the border in Turkey. There's also the Kurdish group, which Erdogan considers terrorist. He calls them terrorist, this ethnic group. So there's sort of these two different groups that they call terrorist, and they say we're going to, protect the nation from either one of those two. But Turkey was kind of reluctant to get involved in the fighting against ISIS. They've just recently, in the last year, said that Western forces can use their air bases to go south and fight. But since then, there's been this sort of retaliation. So it feels like there's almost a temptation from Erdogan to really draw this militaristic response and beef up the strength of his government there. How would you describe just the political corner that Erdogan is in right now in protecting his own nation with such a hostile threat just south of his border?
I suspect that Erdogan believes that basically what's happening now is a consolidation of power, and I believe that in his mind and to his administration, that will only be helpful for Turkey to remain strong and fight its enemies. But of course, it's pushing out, at this point, tens of thousands of police and teachers, people who were keeping civil society and security together domestically. And it's going to be very hard, just from a logistical standpoint, to replace that many people and the work that they were doing in the military, especially. But yes, there's been a long conflict with Kurdish separatist forces, especially in Turkey's southeast. And then when things fragmented so that ISIS became a problem, Turkey was extremely slow to respond to that and didn't think it much mattered. And unfortunately, it took some of the terror attacks you're talking about in Turkey domestically for the administration to realize they needed to focus on that as well.
A lot of senators in the foreign intelligence in that capacity, and they look at the strategy to defeat ISIS. Many of them point to the Kurds as one of the key allies to defeat ISIS, but I can't imagine Turkey's too happy about that.
Oh, absolutely not. Turkey has been very reluctant to have any sort of alliance with the Kurds or to support Kurdish parties. But they did at one point. It was a major advance, I believe. They allowed Kurdish forces from Iraq to transit Turkey in order to go into northern Syria and fight. There was, of course, the big issue with Kobani, the Syrian town in northern Syria on the border with Turkey, where there were great massacres when ISIS infiltrated a while ago. So Turkey has very reluctantly acknowledged the fact that the Kurdish forces are, they would say, a lesser evil. Other observers might say the Kurdish forces are doing a purely positive thing, but Turkey has at least acknowledged that they have a positive role to play in the conflict with ISIS.
We've heard two consecutive vice presidents, and we're pulling some obscure passages here, but Vice President Dick Cheney, Vice President Joe Biden have both acknowledged or recommended that perhaps the Kurds should have their own country, Kurdistan. And to do that, we're speculating here again, but you'd probably have to carve out a portion of Turkey's southern region unless you're going to just move and migrate all these people south into Syria and Iraq and give them their own piece of the country there. You can't go chopping up Turkey as a member of NATO, though, I imagine. So
no, certainly not a policy we can start advocating, no.
Right, but there are some of those in Washington who might be, not so upset if Erdogan is removed from power. We've seen that happen in other places. Guys start moving toward Islamist rule or more they move away from the secular rule. They move toward having more power. Could you make the case that there might be some in Washington who are advocating for the removal of Erdogan from power?
Certainly not openly. Erdogan has become more and more authoritarian over the years. He's been in power now under his Justice and Development Party, the AKP, since 2002. So 14 years is quite a long time, and unfortunately for Turkey, things have gotten steadily worse in that time. At the beginning, there were very positive economic indicators, and that's where a lot of the support for the AKP came from and subsisted for so many years. And at this point, I heard an interesting phrasing that it's no longer at all plausible, the idea that Erdogan is ruling for all Turks. It's very clear at this point that he is pandering to pious Turks, conservative Turks, people who are more religious rather than for all Turks, including the secularists, which are exactly the kind of people that were behind the coup attempt.
Does he have any term limits, or does he have a viable challenger, somebody who might actually overthrow him in an election?
Unfortunately, the main opposition party, which is the Republican People's Party, the CHP, was the party started by Ataturk. They have not had for quite a long time a candidate that onlookers would see and find inspiring, and they had the same person in power for a long time. So no, there's not one excellent, inspiring opposition politician, which is part of why Erdogan, as this strongman, has been able to retain power.
So it looks like the possibility of overthrowing him at the ballot box, that looks slim. Tell us about this guy, Fethullah Gulen. He's currently harbored in Pennsylvania. Turkey says he's behind the whole thing. From the U.S., he's been pulling strings, orchestrating this big uprising in a lot of different sectors. Is one man this many miles away really that powerful?
He is very powerful, more powerful than his supporters would like to discuss publicly, but I do not believe he had anything to do with this coup. It's been clear for a long time that Erdogan has blamed Gulen, who was, as you said, this cleric, who is from Turkey but has been in Pennsylvania now for 18 years. And he has a social movement around him, the Gulen movement, called Hizmet in Turkish, which stands for service. They do a lot of charity work. They do a lot of educational work, opening schools in Turkey and around the world. They claim not to be hierarchical, and Erdogan has for years believed that they are instituting what he has termed a parallel state in Turkey. So that's supporters in the police, in the judiciary, all throughout government. But no, the Gulenists, if you want to refer to the movement that way, they are people who, much like Erdogan and the AKP themselves, they are pious, they are conservative, these are religious people, these are not the pro-Ataturk staunch secularists. And the coup attempt specifically discussed the need for the secular rule of law. So that is directly at odds with what the Gulenists are trying to do.
So here's this guy in Pennsylvania. Turkey's saying you got to extradite him back over. They're also calling for a push to the death penalty. But the State Department is at this point saying they're kind of delaying. They're saying, well, you got to show us evidence. And even if they do file extradition, they say you got to show us evidence. Isn't that sort of superseding their judicial system and saying you have to prove it to us first before you can prove it to whatever judicial system or proceeding would happen in Turkey?
Well, Turkey has been demanding Gulen's extradition for a long time. There was a point in the early 2000s where he had formal charges against him. Those were later dropped. And interestingly, Gulen and Erdogan's party, the AKP, were natural allies for a long time. In recent years, that has changed since 2013 when there was a giant corruption scandal that implicated the AKP, including Erdogan's own son. And Erdogan blamed the Gulen movement because here was this diffuse, shadowy movement of who knows how many people who are working in all aspects of government, and it was a very easy scapegoat. And Erdogan is just still using that as a scapegoat. So it's totally unsurprising that they have a renewed push of demanding Gulen's extradition, but that's nothing new. And the fact that the U.S. is refusing to do so is also nothing new.
So this has been going on for some time, and it's not just not just a result or a consequence of the coup, but rather this has been a request that's been pending for some time now. All right, Sarabrynn Hudgins joining us from Washington tonight. Sarah, you've given us a lot to think about and certainly a lot more still to play out in Turkey. Thanks for your input tonight.
Thank you.